Welcome to Esoteric Artifacts. I'm here with my co-host Sabash, and we have a very special guest with you here today.
Mr. Swanson.
Yeah. So
Mr.
this is
Wonderful.
my good friend Will. He works in enterprise level cybersecurity in sales. He's going to be talking to us a little bit about some of the more recent advances in the direction the industry has gone, and what some of what he's seen overall in terms of companies starting to pay more attention to this, especially after Colonial Pipeline. I think that was a big catalyst when Colonial Pipeline, that East Coast oil and gas company, got locked out of their systems for a couple of days. When even a large energy company is getting infiltrated like that by some random rogue hacker group that's probably sitting in Lithuania, uh, people start paying attention. And cybersecurity has always been one of those areas that companies do not want to spend money on it. It doesn't make them any money. It's a cost center. So
Right.
they always avoid it. And I think a lot of the enterprise level decision makers have finally started to come around and see that it's really important. So
I'll say they're getting there.
yeah,
They're getting there.
yeah,
So just a little bit about me and myself. So I
Yeah.
work with Securonics, as you see. We're a next gen sim platform. So how do I explain this? So in 2009, I'll just give you guys a sales pitch. So in 2009, if you looked at my board, right? So it's full of, ex-military, that sort of thing. So a traditional sim is basically your logging and your correlation, basically for compliance. It's like a checkbox, right? Like they had all these compliance that came down and said, hey, you need to have a sim. And so all these companies purchased sims. And at that time, all they were doing was sucking all the data in, the security data. So when they do have breaches, they can go look on it, right?
So
Well,
can you tell us what a SIM is?
it's security incident and event management.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was what a traditional sim was. So then what my company did, so like I said, I can't speak to exactly what the board is.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about saying this over YouTube. But what I will say is that this conglomerate of individuals, the Snowden thing happened,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so what they wanted to figure out is how do we stop someone from taking, IP from an internal perspective called insider threats, right?
Mhm.
And so out of that came an idea of what's called user and entity behavioral analytics. It's UEBA, right?
Mhm.
And so what we do very well is they said instead of just pulling in the logs and pulling your logs from your firewall, your incident management systems, your IDS systems, your endpoint management, all these different security tools that most companies have, these stop gaps,
Yeah.
roadblocks within your network. Instead of just doing that, how about we map what's the normal behavior for the employee to figure out what's abnormal, and not only map what their behavior is, but map what their behavior is specific to their peers, right? So I'm in sales.
Yeah.
So most sales individuals, they touch the same systems. We download the same files. Like my workday is pretty similar to my peers. I have the same access to different systems as my peers.
Mm-hmm.
So when I am doing something outside of that and abnormal, that is what's called an event. So we basically define that. We like to say we pioneered that marketplace.
So let's go ahead and break that down a little bit. So
Sure.
essentially, what it is you take in information from
Mhm.
these security providers and
Sure.
you disseminate this information and identify abnormal activity versus normal activity and
Yes.
kind of differentiate these different trends.
Correct. For the end user, right? Because everything
Okay.
maps back to the end user.
Right,
Right.
right.
Because we would see some abnormals on a firewall. You may see some abnormals on a actual laptop for your endpoint, right? But typically when a hack happens, it's not just touching one system. It doesn't just happen like this, right? It may
Right.
sit there. Because most times the hackers don't even know what they have access to, for the most part.
Well,
Right?
right. They're feeling out the system at the same time that you're actually observing their access to the system.
Exactly.
So, I guess, can you kind of walk us through how that process typically unfolds? Like, is it typically someone is just probing a system and then,
Mhm.
like, all of a sudden they get access to it?
Mhm.
Or is it more of a targeted attack where they know specifically what it is that they're going for?
Yeah, most times not. Like unless it's like an activist, right, and they're doing it for a purpose in which they want, then they may be targeting something. But for most common hacks, they don't know they know. And most times out of I forget the statistic around it, most of it comes from an end user error, right? I sent you a phasing email. You clicked on it, right? It looks like it came from your boss. You clicked on it and now it just sits there. So they don't
Okay.
really know what they have access to.
Right.
And
Well,
then
so
from there it moves kind of laterally throughout the network.
so in that instance, you're kind of referring to essentially a phishing attack where they're trying to pose as someone else in order to get access to the system on a
Yeah.
deeper level.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay.
Absolutely. And so that's where user and anti-behavior analytics comes into play. But then it kind of goes like, so most analysts, so what a SIM does is just imagine like when you see the movies, right? You see all these guys sitting in a room, they have all these computers, those are called SOC analysts, right?
Right. Right.
And they have a software. I sell that software. So like when I'm talking to companies, believe it or not, and like, you know, at the point of the conversation, enterprise or a small, medium business, they have no idea what it is, right? Because they're not paying for it.
Right.
At this point, most of them, like I'm surprised every day the you know, these large corporations that you would just think they would have a SIM, they don't. They think they're protected with their firewall. They think they're protected with their antivirus. They think they're protected with some of these tools.
Automated, like,
Right. They don't
you know,
they don't
security
have-
protocols.
Exactly. They don't have an actual SOC team, you know. So I have to explain it to them like, hey, if your job was to sift through emails all day, that was your job. The platform in which you use would be important to you, right?
Right.
And then like your what's relevant to you on one day may not be relevant to you another day. So those are called events, right? So what we do is not only do we figure out what's abnormal to figure out what's normal, because like you said, most attacks don't happen just for one instance. It kind of goes through a stage. It's called like MITRE ATT&CK framework. That's like the company behind it. I mean, that's pretty common knowledge as far as like MITRE frameworks.
Right. And like the way I understand it is like essentially if you were trying to gain access to a system, I mean, essentially you probe the system at multiple levels.
Right.
And then one of these, you know, attempts essentially breaks through.
Right.
And that's where you find your vulnerabilities
Correct.
in what you're describing as more of an abnormal event.
Yeah. So like that's what we call like a brute force.
Yeah.
Like they're
Okay.
actually brute forcing. But most, like, you know, the Colonial Pipeline, that didn't happen because someone brute forced into their system. That happened from
Right.
insider threat.
Yeah.
Most stuff happens from insider threat. You know, it's just like psychological things in play. Like I set a USB drive in the middle of your lunchroom and someone just happens to pick it up and put it into their machine.
Well, and I told you this story a few weeks ago, but I was trying to explain to my last employer the importance of securing their systems, and I decided to convince them to indulge me in a little thought experiment. I said, I'm going to leave a flash drive in the break room,
Right.
and we're just gonna leave it there and see how long it takes before somebody picks that up and plugs it into their computer.
Right.
Even though they have no business doing that because that is a computer that's on our network.
Absolutely.
And they, you know, shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be doing that with their home computer either
Sure.
if they don't know whose it
What's on
is.
the flash drive?
But curiosity
Always.
gets all these people and they don't understand the security vulnerability. It was not 15 minutes before
Yeah.
somebody had picked that up and
And that's
put
typically
it
what
into their
happens. Like, you know what I mean? Like, even if it's an email, I mean, we've all been guilty of it. Like, you know, whether it's a text message or an email, we call them typo squatted domains. Like, where it looks like it came from, like, let's say you're a Securonics, for example.
Mhm.
We don't have an E in our name. Like, that's literally on our demo when I'm talking to customers. And they click on it because it looks like it's coming from our CEO, right? And then when you click on it, it doesn't mean like, it's not like, oh, your screen goes blue. They have no idea of what happened with it, right? It's just, they just go on with their workday.
yeah, it just executes a script in the background,
in
right?
the background. And
Yeah.
the script may sit there forever, right? And then that's when the hacker starts to realize what he has access to from that point. So
Right.
then
And
he's
I
like,
mean,
oh, I have access to their SharePoint environment. What's over here? Let me take that data. And then you start seeing the firewall beacon off to some place in, you know, like he was in Lithuania or somewhere.
right.
You
And
know
so,
what I
I mean, I feel like we're essentially like kind of glossing over, but also touching on the topic of like the most common issue in cybersecurity that I see, and I'm
Mhm.
sure you see this as well in the workplace, like is human error
Human error.
of just randomly like, oh, there's some flash drive. Let me see what's on it.
Yeah.
And right there, you've, you know, compromised your system to
Right.
whatever was on that flash drive in the
Right.
first place.
Or a lot of companies, you know, like the idea of insider threat kind of goes broader than just like hacking, right? Because they have like IP. These companies, you know, whether you're a motor company, you know, you have designs and all this other stuff. So like, you know, I was talking to a large employer of, you know, one of the manufacturers for, you know, cars and whatnot. And their main idea around insider threat was just around like, how do I stop my engineers from talking on Reddit about our designs? You know,
Well,
because that's IP to them. They
I
don't
mean,
want that stuff out there.
As an engineer, like we need access to the system when we're developing it, but at the
Right.
same time, like there needs to be that cut and dry threshold of going from engineering to actual real implementation of customers, because
Sure.
like you don't need that access open to everyone.
Right.
And like if you had engineering access to a system, that's basically a blanket admin access to
Right.
essentially all systems.
Yeah. So you bring up another issue. It's called like access outliers, what we call it. It's a function in our system
Okay, yeah.
where like privileged misuse of access, right? So the problem is when you have these large corporations, you have contractors, you have people that move within, different, departments or whatnot, and their access never gets changed,
Right, right.
right? So you may have access that are outside of your scope of work, but no one ever went in there to cut you off that access, right? And so like, one thing that we kind of look at is like, hey, Sabash has this access. He's now in this role. This is what his peers have. These are the functions which you use. Why do he has all these other ones? You probably want to look at that. And typically that was a manual process for IT. There was an Excel sheet that these guys are going through, and it's like labor intensive, which is why it gets glossed over.
Well, and it
But it's
requires communication between departments as well.
Exactly. But it's extremely important because if I compromise Savage and he has all these access to these crown jewels within your organization and all other things as well, it makes this job a lot easier to get, your IP.
Well, yeah, effectively, you only have to engage one person in
The right
order to
person.
get more or less admin access to the whole system overall.
Exactly.
Okay.
So how much corporate espionage do you think is going on right now?
I mean, it's kind of tough to say, because like a lot of times, I first and say that, but some of the customers I speak with, they don't even talk to the level of, if it's not public, right? If it's not like in the media,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? So it's kind of tough to say, but I mean, these places get hit all the time, now whether or not they're actually talking about it is,
So I guess let's take a step back then, and what are the most common issues you see over like day-to-day work? Like what are the top 3 things that companies are concerned with? Is it ransomware? Is it DDoS attacks?
So I would say ransomware, of course, right? That's like low hanging fruit. Everyone cares about that.
Definitely been in the news a lot.
It's
Yeah.
been in the news a lot. So that's for sure. Even though you're not supposed to, I guess the government says you shouldn't pay the ransomware, but most corporations actually do pay the ransomware. Right?
Yeah, we
I
can
mean,
talk about that
For a
yeah.
multitude of reasons. One reason is that
They'll delete your data if you don't.
Well, they'll delete your data, but I mean, let's be honest. Most of these companies, I mean, like disaster recovery is not like a new thing anymore. Most of these companies can get that data back, right? And
yeah,
and that's
but if
the
you
thing.
didn't have any backups, if your only backups were RAID drives on your own server,
Yeah.
and they locked you out of your system and said, "Hey, we're going to delete it all,"
Yeah,
are you going to say we're going to spend $20 million developing all that from scratch?
but that's
again,
what I
or are we
mean.
gonna pay
Like
them
most
the
companies have a disaster
500,000?
recovery plan, so they have these backups off site somewhere.
Yeah.
Like if you're a company that you're still only holding your stuff on your production data, wow.
Well, and so this really gets to the point here is that our businesses in this country are on so many different levels of the spectrum.
Right.
In the manufacturing sector in particular, where I came from,
Right.
there are so many of these large manufacturing operations that are generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue that only have one in-house IT guy and a server that
Oh,
he's
that's for
maintaining.
sure.
No cloud backups.
The sales guy, I
nothing.
never want to talk to you guys.
Yeah.
Manufacturing.
Yeah.
Because they're the most archaic of all the systems.
Yeah, they don't want to update. They
never
like to use
update.
pen and they still use pen and paper.
Yeah, they'll
records
use
for a lot of stuff.
they'll use servers and storage and firewall array, all that good stuff when it's out of support, because it's a cost center to those guys. It doesn't
Mhm.
really affect their business. Like their main business is the OT of devices that are on their floor, right? This is actually generating their products.
Yeah.
IT is just something they have to do for the corporate piece of it. But if you're a manufacturing company, the corporate side compared to what your actual workers, like most of your workers are on a manufacturing floor and that sort of thing, it's not even close to the level of employees that are there compared to the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
But back to your question, I think it's ransomware. And then like there's a new hot like generating, I guess space application security, right? So what you had happen was, during COVID, everyone went remote, right? So a
Yeah.
lot of your internal applications and things of that nature, everyone was accelerating applications to be built and to be built in the cloud so it can be accessed and kill latency and all those other things, right? But the problem is that those things were never configured correctly. So there may be vulnerabilities there.
Because they rush to develop
They
them.
rush to development, you know what I mean?
Well, and there are quick access points in order to give
Exactly.
you remote access to the system, but at the
Exactly.
same time, that remote access is a vulnerability to anyone who might want to penetrate that, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Hackers look at just a wrong configuration in a piece of code, right? And so they all push in, but they had to do it because it was speed. I mean, we didn't know. I mean, it happened in March. It was like everyone's remote now. How do I keep business moving? How do I not sync during this time period? So they had to react quickly. But then also, I mean, digital transformation, I guess is the industry term, that was already happening, where everyone would realize that like, oh, IT is really not a cost center. It's a revenue generator. I have to create these applications for my customers because everyone has a different user experience. Everyone has eBay now. Everyone has, Amazon AWS now. Everyone, I want to pay for something. I want it to be simple. I want it to be quick, and I want it to be here now. And I don't want to wait for anything. So they had to create these. So that was already happening. But then you have your workforce that becomes everywhere. So now your internal applications also have to get pushed out there. And no one secured those things. So now it's what's called application security. It's the acronym I think is Cloud Native is CNAPP. So it's CNAPP, Cloud Native Application Protection products. And so basically the idea is to secure the workload. So as a developer is, writing his code or whatever, right? There's these different companies that would, scan that, that software development and say, hey, this is a point of this is a vulnerability essentially, right? And then the software developer would fix it. And then there's a thing called like securing the actual infrastructure of where those softwares would sit in the cloud, right?
So effectively what you're getting at here is different access points, and where like developers would have different access rights than say a customer or a maintenance manager or an admin even would have different levels of this, security in order to log in and actually get the control that they need.
Well, not even that, but like, when you create a piece of code, like it's talking to different systems, or there's different like, there's different images and there's child processes of different ways that one piece of software may interact with different parts of your business or networks or nodes within your AWS environment.
Okay. So
it's just misconfiguration of how those things are talking. It may not be even on the code.
Okay,
right?
so you're actually going a level deeper into the actual nitty gritty of the code and how these classes and infrastructures actually behave with each other.
Correct.
And that's not properly controlled due to the pandemic and how all these things have expanded over time.
Correct. So it wasn't even that the fact of it's not control. It was just speed. And so no one really looked at the configurations of those things.
Right. There's no security and analysis of it.
So hackers realized that and was like, oh, I can just exploit this one misconfiguration. It might not even be the code. It may be something that is talking to something else, but because that something else had a misconfiguration or there's a vulnerability there, now I have access to the source code of this other application I should not have access to. So because of the speed of that and no one thinking of security, just thinking rapid to keep the business going, application security has become completely hot. So you have like the Wizzes of the world. It was an Israeli-based company. These guys came from like Azure Security, and they started application security. You have the Aqua Securities, you have the Sysdigs, you have the Sneaks. Like all these companies are heavily funded, and they're really, really hot right now in the IT community.
Well, yeah, because they essentially expanded in this, cybersecurity network space where like, I mean, me as a computer science engineer, like I was brought up in like SQL injections and like you really have to sanitize your input in order to properly manage what it is that these users, whatever login credentials they have, like you have to control what they have access to, because you overflow the wrong buffer and all of a sudden they have direct database access or, potentially admin access to run commands.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you have, so like essentially, and the problem was already there, but because of the speed in which we adopt these applications and these technologies, and now that everyone is going to the cloud, for all the reasons everyone goes to the cloud, the scale, the cost control, all that other stuff, even though it's not really cost controlled. But the idea was to take these siloed points of security, and now they're saying, hey, instead of taking these silo, Gartner like runs our industry essentially. I think they run our industry because everyone wants to be in Gartner. Everyone wants to be like a market leader in those sorts of things. So Gartner basically said, hey, instead of just having a company that only is securing the vulnerabilities within the code, or having a point solution that only secures the infrastructure, or having a point security that only secures the actual workload itself, we need a single platform that all these teams can talk and understand the overarching security. Because again, no hacker happens on just a system. It's typically a bunch of systems in which the actual hack moves before it's actually out of your network.
So it's actually really interesting to hear you describe it like that, because it almost sounds like it's sort of a reverse software engineering stack, where like on the software engineering stack, you're essentially building up all of these different layers and all of these different systems that work together and communicate.
Sure.
But on the other side of things, like from an offensive perspective, you're essentially breaking these systems down.
Sure.
And like you gain access to one of them, and that gives you access to another system.
Exactly.
And then that just cascades into another system until you actually get to what is essentially useful or valuable to you.
Because we've all worked in corporations, right? Like everything's siloed. Every division has their, like the software developers, like they don't really care about the infrastructure guys. They only care about when they push their stuff to production, right?
Right.
When their product actually works in the production.
Well, so that's what I wanted the two of you to provide some clarification on, if you can. Is this, this layered sort of security vulnerability that you're describing right now,
Sure.
that of interconnected systems that are communicating with each other.
Sure.
Is that,
or processes.
Is this primarily a problem in large enterprises that are using a ton of different software sets to accomplish various tasks within their organization, or is this a problem also for small business?
You want my answer, or do you want to like the industry?
So I guess I'll go ahead and jump in, and then you can go ahead and go from your angle more on the offensive side of things, because I'm much more experienced on the development and creation, like in general, the defensive side of things. But like you build up all these systems, and like the first thing that you're concerned with is how do we make them work together? Exactly. Because if the systems don't work, then they're not actually useful.
Right.
And so like you end up developing this prototype and like essentially proof of concept in order to make sure that it works. And you build layer on layer until you get to the point where it's profitable for your company.
Right.
But then in general, from a software engineering perspective, like you should have various stages at which you refactor and control these types of mechanics. Like I kind of touched on a little bit earlier, where you have SQL injection and like these more brute force login mechanics.
Sure.
But essentially these things get overlooked on one level or another. Like from my perspective, I'm an engineer. So in developing the system, I need access to multiple layers in order to make sure that they all work together.
Sure.
But on the other side, you need to be able to deconstruct these layers to say, oh no, like this person shouldn't have access to all these different things.
Sure.
So like, is that more, I guess, what more or less what you're seeing on the offensive side of things? Like, how are these essentially deconstructed?
Yeah. So I think you're thinking of it from a standpoint of like an access, like, or me having privileged rights, right? The main problem is like, for instance, a system admin, right?
Right.
His job is nothing more than to make sure that whatever, whether it's a server or whatever, that he is, his admin rights are, right? Whatever his job function is, his job is to configure those resources to the applications to make sure that they're running at an optimum level, right? So he is configuring something as far as on the actual server itself, right?
Right.
So when he has when he's configuring it, he may be configuring it in a way that causes a vulnerability to your application, right? And so it's more so like less than more than an access or from an admin. Like when you say access admin, I'm thinking of someone like logging into something.
Right. Exactly.
More of that, because that's also important, right? That would be a crown jewel that a hacker would see.
Essential base layer,
yeah, but
right?
How he's getting in it is if he misconfigured it wrong.
Right.
If he's actually misconfiguring that server wrong, that's giving him a vulnerability. It's like having a port scan, right? If you misconfigure that port and I see that it's an open port and no one knew that, that's an access point for me as a hacker. It had less to do about me earning your rights as whoever's job is to configure those ports. It had more to do with I saw your systems and how your infrastructure was built, and I did a port scan and I realized this port was open and it gave me access to it.
So right there, essentially the base problem is sanitizing the input, right?
Yeah, sanitizing the input, sanitizing the configuration, understanding how these systems are talking to it, and when you're doing it at such a rapid speed, there's oversight sometimes.
Right. And like you have to explicitly control the parameters of like
Yeah.
what characters can be used and how much length is
Exactly.
appropriated and like all these, more mathematical details about what's being entered into the system and what's
Exactly.
accepted versus just, thrown away
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, because what I found fascinating about cybersecurity is one thing is like once you're in, you can move east and west all you want to across the network.
I mean,
You don't really need access once you're actually in.
essentially that's just how computer systems work, right? So once you're a user in the system, you can observe the certain access rights and the different limitations of the system, but at the same time you have to have certain rights in order to influence certain systems.
Sure.
So I guess let's dive into that a little bit more, into how is it that people particularly access enterprise systems? Like, do you typically see people access at the user level and try and understand the system more? Or do you typically see attacks more at the root level where they're actually trying to control the system to some degree?
It's again, it depends on what their goal is, right? I mean, hacking is like such a. I mean, I remember I saw the Cisco report. Like, I want to say like the amount of money they make compared to the amount of money that corporations spend is like 5 to 6x, right? And most of it's on data.
You said the Cisco report?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like most of it's on data, right? So like a healthcare institute, like those social security numbers and names and all that other stuff, that stuff's a lot more important. Or like, understand their Medicaid or their, all these different things that go into it. Those types of scams for hackers and selling that stuff on the black web goes for a lot more money. Like if you want to attack someone's source code, like you want to understand like the underlying understanding of that application. I don't know the use case for that. I'll just be honest. I don't know if that's profitable.
Well,
there's companies out there that have been caught for, like their source code or vulnerability being like we had the big one with Log4j that just came out. Like that wasn't even that long ago.
So what you're saying is that the data is so intrinsically valuable at this point.
The data is very intrinsically valuable.
They don't need to go after anything. They can just capture the data and sell that.
Well, let me try and put this into a little bit better perspective for people. Like essentially like the IP of a company is valuable, but you need to understand it on such a fundamental level in order to actually extract value from it.
Right.
That these companies, like especially like Google and like Netflix and these companies that are like actually profiting, or Facebook especially, like these companies that are profiting off of the data that they collect from you, the data is infinitely more valuable than the IP that they have.
The IP that they have.
Like,
absolutely.
This,
I mean, of course, there's that portion of what he was saying, incorporating espionage, when they're, I want to know what Ford is doing. But when I'm talking to corporations, that's not the conversations that come up that they're talking about. They're
interested in the data and like I mean, not necessarily the what I refer to as PII or personally identifiable information, but like the key characteristics about the people that use the system and like how they can sell things to you and like advertisements and marketing and all these different aspects of just you accessing the system tells them so much information about you.
Correct.
Okay.
They're a lot more interested in that sort of thing. Like now there's more sophisticated, like when I said the insider threat company insider threat program that I was talking to, that was an extremely large corporation. Large corporation. And there's also, like there's a piece of that, right? But it's not from a standpoint of the actual system. Like when I talk to them, they're like, oh, well, how do I stop, like one of the use cases that we give it's called a flight risk, right? Where Will goes in and he's going to another company I'm a sales guy, right? And I'm taking all my information about who we've worked with, those companies, those contacts. How do they stop me from taking that information and going to another company? Because even though I created these contacts, I work for them, so it's their IP. So they want to stop that. It's called a flight risk, right? So they talk from those perspectives. I rarely run into a company that's like worried about like their actual product. I mean, they are, but they're not. It doesn't come up as far as a topic of conversation what they're most concerned about.
Well, from that type of perspective, I mean, the companies would have to have like the infrastructure and like the overall like software setup in order to actually capitalize on that. Whereas like a flight risk, essentially they could steal your customers, for example, and like
Absolutely.
jump in the middle of that and
Right.
actually cut your, potentially your IP or your, particular advantage in that industry out of the equation entirely.
Or they just want to know who you've talked to. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's people that hit me up all the time, like, oh, like I'm in SIM and one of our biggest competitors called Exabeam. Like, oh, I can give you an Exabeam list. And all of that lets me know is where Exabeam is sitting, so I can go take them out.
Well, and this is something that I touched on with Sabash in one of our previous episodes, is like this kind of information gathering is essentially happening all the time at governmental levels, especially on like the DoD level between like CIA, NSA, MI5, FSB, all the different organizations around the world. Like this just essentially happens all the time. For this to happen on a more corporate level, I felt like was inevitable and to some degree was happening constantly.
Well,
so this is something that like you see regularly in industry.
I would say so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
It's so widespread at this point. I think was it you who told me that the DMV has been selling our data?
The DMV is selling our data.
DMV in our state made $250 million dollars over the course of 10 years selling just name, address, and address data.
It's insane.
I mean, like the post
data
office
has overtaken, as far as like the market, it's overtaken oil. Data.
Yeah.
Data has. Just data. Which is insane to me.
Well, I mean, like even when you think about like the simplest aspect of that, like the post office, they have your name and where you live, and that shit gets updated regularly. And I mean, if you go on vacation, what's one of the first things you think of? Oh, I need to stop my mail so that they, don't keep delivering it while I'm abroad for a month or whatever it is. Like they have that up to date information just readily available. Like, why wouldn't they just sell it and make a profit off of that?
Right. They all do.
But at the same time, it's like, well, now who has access to the data? There's no controls over that, right?
There's none. Yeah.
Okay. There's no overarching federal body that's like managing your personal data.
So it's funny you bring up a good point. Like there's a new emerging market called privacy ops. So you have players like OneTrust.
Okay.
They've been in business for maybe like 3 or 4 years. They're valued at like multi-billion-dollar company. There's a company called Security AI. And all they're doing is they're basically kind of what I said about the UEBA from a standpoint that everything maps back to a user. They're basically mapping everything back to the employee, right? And then whether structured or unstructured, because like you can produce metadata at all times. Every system you interact with is producing some sort of metadata.
Right.
And so because of compliance reasons like GDPR and all these other different compliances, and we're going to have more, you kind of heard Biden talk about it on the State of the Union. We're going to have more like these compliances getting pushed down because the government realizes this is a problem, right?
Right.
Like
well,
we have to be able to protect the people's actual privacy, their data, because essentially it's your privacy.
Right. Well, so you kind of touched on this a little bit of like these different trust companies, and especially Biden at the State of the Union. Like, there's this company that I've personally worked with, I didn't trust, where they actually focus on your, civilian status and like actually verifying your personal information.
Sure.
Not only on like a personal level, but on like a federal level of like corroborating it with different agencies in order to ensure, for example, security clearance, but also civilian status and, criminal record, for example. And so like, these are things that are essentially being built up, currently, like as we're living. Some of them already exist, right?
Sure, absolutely. So you got to think about it, like that company you're talking to, and this is where like the whole idea of, cybersecurity or insider threat security. That company you're working with, they're collecting all this data about you, right? And that data is going to sit on some sort of repository. That's a lot more valuable than how they collect it.
Right. I mean, every single thing that you click on, every link, everything you type in a Google search bar is tracked somewhere.
Everything. That repository is sitting somewhere. And it's traded 1,000 times over. Which is pretty interesting to me. But it's funny, I was looking at this company called, I think it's, let's say Daydream, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And what they're doing, I thought it was really cool. So I've always thought that like we should be operating kind of how Alaska operates with their oil, right? Where we get kickbacks based on our data because it's already here, right? There's no way to stop. There is no way to stop the selling of our data. We've already these systems, our phones, our social media, we already interact with them too much, and this data's already being collected. There's no way to take that back. There's no way to revert that.
I mean,
so it's like, how do we get our portion or our piece of the pie? And this company's kind of figured that out a little bit.
So to some degree, I agree with that, but at the same time, I feel like it's a misunderstanding of education.
Sure.
Like, I mean, essentially everything you do in the world, like the idea that that is your own is a completely insane idea.
Sure.
Because anyone around you who sees you do that has observed it and therefore has access to your data, essentially.
Of course.
I mean, what we're doing is abstracting that into a computer space so that, you know, you went to a web page and you clicked on a particular article or a particular link, but that's no different than someone observing you walking into a store, for example. It's just a different conceptualization because when you're sitting in front of a computer, you don't think of anyone else watching you.
Right.
But at the same time, they are. You're just not consciously aware of it all the time.
I think the importance there is informed consent. Glenn, the issue that I see there is that people didn't understand explicitly that all these services that they were using that were free on the internet, they were the product. Right. We know that now. And, you know, some of us have known that for many years, but it's becoming more mainstream. It's becoming understood in a more mainstream fashion, thanks to like documentaries like not the Social Network. What is that?
Analytica?
No, there was a documentary that was made that was really popular. That was basically just talking about breaking down some of those concepts of how much your data is sold and how much you are the product. And this is why I don't use any Google. I use pretty much no Google products other than Gmail at this point. Because I don't use their search engine. I use, you know, a completely separate search engine. And to your last point about getting paid for your data, I think we are kind of moving in that direction. There's resistance to it, but blockchain technology is kind of taking us in that direction where you are getting paid in a tokenized form. The browser that I use right now, Brave, pays me a percentage of the revenue that they're generating every time they expose me to ads. I actually have not been exposed to ads for many years because I run all these ad blockers and tracker blockers on whatever browser I'm using. But I permit my current browser to show me ads periodically because they're paying me a crypto token for it.
Sure.
Well, so that's something that I actually want to hear your opinion about, Will, is, I mean, we're nearing this stage very quickly where we can enter into this essentially decentralized blockchain space.
Yeah.
Or at the same time, we can enter into this very centralized, you know, quote unquote, Google space where everything is controlled by this one singular entity, or it's controlled in, like I was alluding to previously, this decentralized space where it's essentially bought and sold behind the scenes.
Sure.
Where you still benefit from it, but it's not one singular entity that controls all of it.
Sure.
So I guess kind of what is your
opinion on that?
Well, I guess your opinion overall, but also what do you think is the more likely outcome?
I just think the centralized, because I mean it's past the least resistance. So where we're at already, right?
Do you not see the war that's going on between centralization and decentralization?
I mean, I do, but I just think that right now the powers that be have control over the centralization. So it's,
absolutely,
to you know, they're gonna win unless.
I'm of the same mind as Will. Like, you know, centralization is clearly the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like, if you have a clear path that it will succeed, you're not going to invest in this arbitrary system that may or may not prove successful.
Like, personally, I would like the decentralized, but I don't think it's gonna. I don't think because it's already centralized.
Well, and it kind of always has been through the course of all of human history,
right?
Taking, you know, leadership and freedom, even this country as a concept was revolutionary because most people through most of history were pretty content living as vassals under kings and nobles, because it provided safety and security relatively to being on your own and, you know, having your farm raided by bandits.
Right.
And yeah, to a degree, we haven't really evolved from that mindset. Some people have a preference for freedom and decentralization,
We
but
have the illusion of decentralized, but it's not really.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like that's really what we're getting at here with this centralization versus decentralization sort of, conceptual conversation.
Right.
Is it really comes down to essentially an informed populace.
Right.
And the idea that you can, inform a populace in mass about
Right.
a decentralized environment, like that's just not realistic
It's not
in today's
realistic.
environment,
It's not.
especially as things become more technically adept just to understand them, let alone work with them.
Right. I think like most things, like you can have an ideal, and on its basis, on its surface, it can be very innocent. But there's always going to be something that someone is going to say, how can I capitalize on that? I think that's even a problem with like technology. You know what I mean? Like we're creating all these things and we're innovating at such a rapid pace, and on its surface, it may seem innocent. There's always going to be someone that says, how can I sell their data? How can I create a profile and influence their behavior? Like we love all these systems that we're interacting with. We love all these things that we do. We love the access we have. We love the speed we have. I can order something. I DoorDash every night. All these different services that we have. But there's always going to be someone that can manipulate and exploit those things, I guess is my point.
So I guess, do you think that's more of I'll say Achilles heel of capitalism, or more of a misunderstanding of the technical age that we're in and just the sheer capabilities that we have now that we haven't been accustomed to?
I think this is the first one. I can't remember how you termed it, to capitalism, but I think it's the first one. Absolutely.
Okay.
well, so then do you think with socialism and democratic socialism and all these variants of this ideology becoming more popular, do you think that if we were to actually transition into one of these systems, whatever level of implementation you get from that, do you think that you would eliminate this problem of people trying to capitalize, or do you think that's a human nature thing?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think that kind of goes to the point of like, I guess by generation, I would have a different feel. You know what I mean? Like I think for, it's hard to change how you're taught. You know what I mean? I always tell people like, like I'm very against like, well, I won't say against, but I think the rich should pay their fair share. Right?
Yeah.
But I'm also a capitalist. I'm going to operate in an ecosystem which you've given me. So if I was in their position, I would do the exact same things.
Yeah,
I mean, because you can't change how I've been taught. You can't change the environment which I grew up in. You know what I mean? And I only know it one way. So it would take something radical to force, like you see in the movies. It would take like something where everything shut down and we had to depend on each other in order to succeed. Then maybe coming out of that, we'd be able to do something like that.
So like an external threat, like alien invasion or something.
Exactly. It would take something radical. But as it is right now, no one's going to just choose to do that. Well, there's always going to be someone sitting in the corner saying, I can exploit this.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially you grow up in this environment and, constantly you're just aware of what are the weaknesses of it and how can I take advantage of this.
Because you're programmed to.
I mean, make the best of it for yourself because, regardless of how much you want to help other people, it is a selfish game in that you need to be squared away before you can help anyone else. Yeah. And so getting yourself ahead is the best case scenario, regardless of your personal preferences on ideology or anything
100%
beyond that. Okay.
100%.
Well, and this is, you see this all over the world. You see this in every society, regardless of system. And I'm not saying that every place is exactly the same. I mean, you do see stronger senses of communalism in some places, but there is this element of, looking out for yourself and in extension, your family, your loved ones, and your community at large, but yourself first and foremost is what everyone's looking out for. And in a way, I think a lot of the reason we're able to have this debate is because we've reached such a point of prosperity at this point that it's kind of a luxury to even be able to think about this, right? If we were out, in the forests, like trying to, hunt and kill our food still, you don't have the luxury of talking about.
Well, it depends. I mean, like that's kind of prosperity subjective. You know what I mean? Like happiness is subjective.
It's subjective, but I would say we're objectively far more prosperous than any period of time in human history.
But it's kind of like like I love like anything. If there's a show out there that's got people stuck on a spaceship or something like that, I'm all for it. Or like an ecosystem. Mm-hmm. But you always see those things, right? Everyone has their purpose. Everyone is, they're living pretty well off.
It's
in their ecosystem,
the controlled structure.
Controlled structure.
Yeah. There's clearly defined roles.
I love that type of thing, right? Like if the world can be that in that harmony, ideally, of course, right? It's like everyone has purpose. Everyone wakes up. They, their necessities are taken care of. You know what I mean? And I think when your necessities taken care of, it's innovation, right? If I didn't have to work, who knows what I would actually be doing in my life?
Well,
right?
I mean,
there's always someone at the top of those shows.
I mean,
exploits.
I'm clearly very much in the engineering innovation mindset, but like, if I didn't have the freedom to pursue these endeavors, like, what would I be doing on a day-to-day basis? Like, I would be a farmer, or I might be in the military. Like, I wouldn't just be this scientist who could go around and study, whatever whatever freedoms that I have and opportunities that are available to pursue.
Well, to what both of you guys are talking about, an interesting thing that like a common thread that pops up in socialist Twitter every couple months is a conversation about, hey comrades, what will be your role after the revolution?
First problem, they say comrade.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean that's how they talk in commie Twitter. But.
I'm kind of poking fun at the linguistics that they use.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they use this as a concept of comrades. We're all in this together.
Right.
But essentially, the core issue there is that there's a huge hurdle that has to be met initially in who gives up their freedoms in order to pursue that.
Exactly. Hang on. You're jumping the gun.
Well, so let me reel it back a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so like we're in this fortunate society, especially here in the US, where we have people at all different levels of society to where, I'm fortunate enough to be able to pursue my dreams as an engineering scientist and actually pursue some of this. There's 100,000 nameless, faceless people who the vast majority of society will never consider, but they are absolutely essential to me being able to do what I want to do.
Right.
And that's completely eliminated from the entire social comrade type conversation. Sure. Like that's just eliminated from it as like, yeah, that'll happen somewhere behind the scenes.
Right.
And I really don't like that from for my own personal perspective, a socialist versus capitalist perspective. Like any capitalist I've ever talked to, like they associate that with is this is essential and necessary, and without it we can't do what we do.
Sure.
And I that's one thing that I really respect about the capitalist mindset.
Right.
I don't know how you guys feel about that.
No, I mean, it's a tough. Like I said, I mean, we talked a little bit before we had joined. On the podcast. Like, I'm a capitalist because of the environment I was in. Right. Like, if I had my way, just because no one likes to see, as you were saying, those others that don't get to chase their what's the names, right?
Right.
But then there's also a bit there of where my capitalist mindset comes in. Like, that's your choice. You know what I mean? Because I believe, like, I wasn't given this opportunity. You know what I mean? Like, I actually chased it. You know what I mean? I actually wanted it. So you'll always have those. But yeah, I mean, I think there's always a fine line. You know what I mean? There's always going to be people that aren't complacent and are overdoers, and like they like to challenge themselves. But I think you can have a marriage of both of those. I think if you look at like capitalism from what it's actually supposed to be, I don't think our current system is actually a capitalist society.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Like, our current system is not a capitalist society.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
But if you look at capitalism on its essence, then yes. But what we currently are and what we're calling it, how we're messaging it, the marketing term of capitalism, not really. It's not really there.
Yeah. But no, so Glenn, back to the point I was trying to get at was What do you think the most common answers were in that Twitter thread about what these socialists and communists believed that they would be doing after the revolution?
Oh, well, I mean, as far as what they believe they would be doing,
what do you think they were saying?
Very clearly, the first thing that jumps out at me is they believe that they would be changing the world. And what I mean by that is like on a very fundamental level, to the point of like Elon Musk. Like, I mean, say what you want about Elon Musk and Tesla and SpaceX, but he changed the world. He made an electric vehicle possible for the everyday consumer.
Yeah.
And so when you think about these, you know, for lack of a better description, I'll call them socialist minded people, they're talking about renewable energy. Right. They're talking about the welfare state, like universal basic income. They hit these talking points like there's something that's achievable in the next couple years, which, yeah, I mean, I would agree the same as you will. Like this doesn't make sense from a scientific perspective, let alone any other level.
Well, you're looking at this from a way too abstract perspective. It's a very simple answer. Overwhelmingly, most of them said, I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to be a garden. I'm going to have a garden. I'm going to be a a poet, or something, a writer. And it's like, who is going to be the plumbers? Who is going to run the energy grid? Who is going to do all of these essential things? And this is what you guys are talking about in terms of the people that are overlooked, that are required for you to be able to be an engineer.
Right.
The way we've ordered society currently, there is a ton of people that are involved in that process to make that possible. Whereas if all of these people that favor this ideology of, of communism, socialism, whatever it is, if they all want to be artists and they want to, pursue their passions, and their passions are, nobody's passion is to be a trash collector.
Yeah.
But it's something that needs to get done.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I kind of glossed over it, and I guess I completely jumped over what you were getting at here. Yeah. But I mean, essentially, that's the issue: is someone who is an artist or truly creatively minded. There's nothing productive that someone else can use. Now, that's not to say there's nothing productive about art.
Well, it's not measured on its productivity. Art is valuable for different reasons.
That's exactly it. It's valuable for different reasons.
Sure.
Because like from an engineering manufacturing perspective, I can create a machine that can, for example, help you do your job more efficiently. Right. But if I create a piece of art for you that makes you feel happier and more productive at your job, that's not a quantifiable metric on a larger scale. Well, exactly. It depends. But in order to think of it from that more of a creative sense, which it's actually funny that you bring that up, because that is what I commonly see and immediately gloss over because I'm an engineering minded person.
Right.
But like, that's not something that is effectual on a larger scale. It's extremely effectual on an individual scale.
Sure.
But you can't evaluate that in a company or even a nationalistic sense.
Any of those things, whenever you're creating a product or a company, you need a bunch of individuals that makes it collective. So if you're affecting on an individual scale, it could.
Yeah, and art also has major cultural impact. Art, it's ended certain conflicts.
So after every sale, I listen to a song. Every trip.
Yeah.
Every time. It changes my mood.
I would
sell more.
I would absolutely agree with you, but at the same time, I would ask you a follow-up question as how many people do you need to create that moment versus productive people?
Well, and how good do they need to be at it? Not everybody is actually talented at art.
Well, that's true. The other thing is, at the same time, not everybody's talented at it, but not everybody speaks the same way to it.
That's true.
Like, I've heard a variety of people show me different art where it didn't speak to me.
Sure.
But I've heard, a few very select instances where I'm just completely floored by the amount of talent and ingenuity that went into that. And it's just because it spoke to me.
Right. I think it's based on an individual. Like, even when you speak about art, like how you're looking at it and how I look at it is different.
Absolutely.
Like, I look at all art like it just evoked my emotion. Like if you give me a feeling, if you could take me back to a past time, or you could take me to a present time, or even a future time, you know what I mean? Like that is a beauty of art. Like music, I love music. Like before I was in cybersecurity, I was a rapper. You know, I rapped. You know what I mean? Like, and I took that. That's my passion. It's what I love to do. There's nothing that's like a stage to me. You know what I mean?
Hell yeah.
But that's not where my life took me. You know what I mean? That's not. It wasn't driving my. It wasn't going to the levels of where I saw my life being, and so that took me to different things. But I will say, I tell everyone this. Like, I think what I learned there and being on the stage and all those things, and connecting with people, it absolutely has to do with the salesperson I am.
Yeah, you gained a lot of skill.
Or the
you gained
engineer I am.
confidence
Like,
from it, I'm sure.
Yeah,
too.
like I have no fear of sitting in a boardroom and talking to individuals about any product. I have no nervousness of that.
Well, I mean,
because I've been on the stage.
Just sitting here talking to you, like, I mean, if I didn't have my creative background, like, I don't know how I would ever conceivably associate what I know about technology and engineering in order, to know what you understand about sales and the way the world works. And so, like, that part is essential, but how do you quantify that? And I feel like that's something that's sorely missed, especially in,
I think we were
talking about that, like, more socialist conversation.
It's a deeper discussion too, because I think you quantify, like, even as I've grown, and we kind of call it base here, but even if I like it, the conversation, even as I've grown, like, I've recognized, like, individuals have different ways of thinking. You know what I mean? And some individuals in their way of thinking pushes innovation, it pushes product, it pushes things forward. Like, I've recognized that I have a naturally curious mind. You know what I mean? So, like, even when I'm looking at other sales individuals, like, I understand that you are here just for a check. You were here just to sell your product. But I have a curious mind. So I actually want to know the nuts and bolts of what I'm selling. And it's not because I find it fascinating. You know what I mean? I got into cybersecurity because I literally thought it was fascinating. I used to sell infrastructure beforehand, storage. Those conversations were completely boring to me. There's no real, I didn't really care about, oh, your storage array went down, and so your company lost X amount of dollars because of that storage array, or production going down. That doesn't mean anything to me. But, oh, there's people's data getting stolen, and this person is now stuck trying to, figure out why her identity got stolen, and she's, now she's down on her bad luck, or he's down on his bad luck. That's a real world impact on me. So I feel like I'm making a difference.
It essentially sounds like it's that kind of like meeting ground between not only like understanding the engineering, like more productive concepts, but also like the creative components of like why those engineering more productive components matter.
Yeah. I think you got to understand that, you know what I mean? But I was saying that to say, like, I think that's how you can quantify those things, like thought and traits. Sometimes, like, on this basis level, it's just a trait that a person has. Like, you just have a trait. You know what I mean? It just so happens that you're a software engineer. Right. I just have a trait. It just so happens I'm in sales. You understand what I'm saying? And some people don't have those traits, and that's okay. Like, I have a buddy of mine that, he's not he's like, Will, I don't know how, even my dad said, like, I don't know how you think of all the outcomes, all the whys. My brain, I would be exhausted if I thought like you. You know what I mean? Or if my buddy tells me something, he's like, I'll be exhausted if I always just trying to climb. Because he's like, he owns this gym, he makes his cash, and he's completely content. I don't have that in me. I just don't. You know what I mean? And in ways, I wish I was like him. You know what I mean? I was like, I would be a lot less stressful. I would go to sleep on time. I wouldn't be up at 4 o'clock thinking about all these different ideas I have, or like, how do I get to the next level, or how I do that.
Right.
But his trait is needed. He's helping individuals in his 40 people gym.
That's absolutely essential. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I think those traits that I have was why Elon Musk is able to, because he dares to think that way.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, he dares to do that. So that's how I think it's quantifiable. I guess it's my.
Yeah. I mean, especially with you in particular, is like, not only to the Elon Musk level, obviously that's a whole nother level of going off on your own tangents, but like, these people are essential to society, and like, we need somebody to think through these problems because not everybody's doing it.
Right.
And I mean, in particular, just especially you with computer, cybersecurity, like there aren't enough people doing cybersecurity in order to explain like why this is important.
Right.
let alone to actually handle the problem of you need to actually secure your data, and this is important.
And I think it's changing. You know, I mean, that was a good segue back to the topic, but I think it's changing for sure. You know, I think I saw a stat that like cybersecurity spends like $156 billion in the next 2 or 3 years. It's supposed to go up to like 340 or somewhere around there. So it's going to double, which is insane to me. You know what I mean? And there's not a lot of individuals that are in the space. You know what I mean? Like cybersecurity has like, from a resource standpoint, like has a 0% unemployment rate.
Well, I feel like that's really, I mean, essentially what the issue is like these industries, especially cybersecurity in particular, of like these industries, you know, kind of spin up essentially out of nothing because no one was aware of it beforehand. But now it's getting to the point where like this is a common issue that we all need to be aware of.
Well, I think it's like a growing up of America, of, you know, of, I want to say America, of, you know, the world, right? Like I think when I first got into IT, right? The idea of your IT team, your network admin, your system admin, you know, your backup and all these guys, it was the conversations of they don't have budget. You know what I mean? The CIO is kind of like he has a C level, but he doesn't have any budget. DevOps and these other revenue creating things had, you know, more of the budgets, and it was cared for more by the company because the company is always doing what? They're trying to create profit. That's what they're around. And so this was just like a cost center. I have to do this for this stuff to run. Okay, you need this. Here you go. But then things started to change, right? People started to be more on the web. People started to interact with companies different. Like, you know, you had the malls were going away. Now everyone is online. You know what I mean? Then we have the phone. Now everyone needs an app. And so then organization changed and said, oh, these guys are absolutely essential. We need these guys and we need more of them in order to compete in the marketplace. And so then you have that time of it. And now I think it's shifting to, oh no, I have to actually secure all of this stuff that I have built over the last 5 to 6 years. So it's the same issue. It's just kind of growing up into this whole digital workforce, essentially.
What you're talking about, the scale of the timeline of how fast this is all expanded. I mean, we were born around the .com bubble. Like that, that was like, you know, within our lifetime is when these technologies even began to start going in this direction. And when we were growing up, I mean, I didn't have a smartphone until I was in high school.
I mean, I had a smartphone before I was in high school, but not that much before.
Yeah, it wasn't there when we were kids.
And they were also in the Midwest. From a technology standpoint, like any tech company I've ever worked for, we were always the last to accept or adopt technology. Like I think about just when I would say no more when I worked for
this region.
Oh, absolutely. We adopt technology at such a slow pace.
Definitely on the tail end. I mean, it's interesting to see like how when we grew up, like, I mean, it was available, but like it was very specially available.
Right.
Like not everyone had it. There were like the handful of kids in high school who had the latest, greatest, and like that was the coolest stuff in the world, right? That you all just wanted to learn about. And I feel like a big part of that was just our age group and the fact that we were growing up.
Sure.
But like, especially these days, like there's all kinds of stuff popping up in Silicon Valley, in Texas, on the East Coast that like, we hear about it, but like, it's not actually available to us on a broader scale.
Well, I think it's because of that way, because they adopted technology quicker. I don't think Silicon Valley would be as big as it was if they didn't adopt the technology quicker. I mean, like any tool I sell to an enterprise or anything that new comes out, we're always, you know, if you look at companies or all these different startups, they're always coming out of out west or east, or they're coming from abroad, right? And if you look at where their footprint is from a customer standpoint, it's always in those same locations because they adopt the technology quicker. You know, once they scale, they recognize, oh, Ohio has 27 of the top Fortune 500. I should probably go there. You know, Chicago has 37. I should probably go there.
Well, do you think that's more of it's developed out there, or it's a matter of we want it to be tested before we fully adopt it in the Midwest?
I think it's a little. Well, I just think it's a demographic standpoint. You know what I mean? Like, I still talk to people that be like, I don't want to put my stuff in the cloud. It's not secure. It's like, buddy, AWS is a lot more secure than your brick and mortar. I could promise you that.
Well, it's like
I could promise you.
I'm a software engineer developer. I don't even work on the security side of things, but like define secure. Like
well, they just they're ideal because they can go touch it. They can go in the back room and their servers and everything is sitting there, and they don't want to park their application somewhere in the cloud because in their mind they can't see it. They don't know where it is.
I feel like that's
so it's just the immaturity of their thought process, and then it's the demographics of who sits in those seats. It's kind of the conversation that we had earlier.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I feel like that's essentially the disconnect, especially with like the West Coast to like Midwest kind of comparison is like it's what you know and what you associate with being secure. And like historically, we associate this type of security with like hands-on access. Like, did you physically go in the vault?
Did you lock it?
Right.
And put the backups in the vault.
Well, and like, right, exactly. And like now we're in this age of data security where it's like, I didn't need to go there.
Yeah.
It's locked.
It's locked.
And like, unless I give you access, nobody has access.
It's like, buddy, AWS has hundreds of data centers. That thing is replicating so many different ways. Trust me, it's secure.
Right.
It's secure.
Like it exists in multiple different spaces. And even if you got access, especially in the case of AWS, like even if you got access to one of those server locations, you only have access to a portion of the data.
It's a small portion.
And even that portion, like
it's replicated somewhere.
You can't parse that.
Yeah.
Like it's only part of it. If you have to get all of it in order to actually read it.
It's almost like you want to pull up a YouTube. Like, do you want to see these data centers? I mean, these guys have like military guys.
I mean, there was one.
I doubt you get in there, buddy. Trust me, I have a lot better chance of getting into your back closet. Trust me.
There's CIA data housing. Yeah. CIA has several hundred.
But those are the conversations that I would have here. Whereas out there, they were adopting cloud very, very early.
Yeah. But it is also costly to be an early adopter of any technology.
It's costly. It's definitely costly, and I just think it's just lack of understanding of how technology works. That's why I really think.
I feel like that's essentially a scaling problem with technology, especially is because like you can have a certain amount of data and you can have it secured on like an individual computer.
Sure,
but like as soon as you scale that up to a multiple computers worth of data, like you're talking server level access, like just one server. I'm not even getting to the AWS server farm style. Like that's a whole different ball game.
Yeah.
Like you're not talking about one person's data. You're talking about like 50 to 150 people's worth of data.
Right.
You get to a server farm style. You're talking about 5,000 to 500,000 people's worth of data. The scalability is totally different from a physical access system.
And so just to put it in perspective, you speak of a good point. Like the data of that, right? That would be an issue from if I'm talking to a more SMB type company, right? They don't really have the scaling issues of a nationwide. They're just not the same. They don't have to scale or innovate or push out data at that point, right? So typically, nationwide would understand that. The SMB wouldn't. In cybersecurity, neither one of them are understanding that. I run into corporations that are very large, and it blows my mind the lack of security that they have. It just blows my. It's like, so you're just. I mean, I talked to a healthcare provider, right? A hospital at that, which is like top of the line data. Like it sells for more on the black market than any other data, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely personal data at its top.
Yeah, I would say over 10,000 employees. So it's a pretty regional hospital. 0 SIM. Not only actually, I take that back. They had a SIM. They were only ingesting, I would say, less than a quarter of their data. So they were only getting security analytics and actually looking for threats on a quarter of their data. And so that's like completely like I would never go to that hospital and want to put my information in there. It's just not secure.
Right. So
open box.
So let's kind of run this back from an enterprise perspective.
Sure.
I mean, you're talking about SIMs, talking about data, at the server level.
Sure.
What are, let's say the top 3, more if it comes to mind, what are the top 3 concerns of yours dealing with a new business?
A new business?
Yeah. A new customer.
A smaller customer, or like does it matter on employee size?
So let's generally talk about, smaller company size. We're not talking, like 20, 30, whatever thousand.
So, you're going to have it's just a normal thing. It's just technology just involved, right? So like everything's machine learning. Everything is about automation at this point. So you always have like, you're going to have your email security. You're going to have your endpoint security. You're going to have your firewalls, your switches, and all these things that lead up into what you call cyber. Like how we look at it, it's like the user at the laptop, and then it's just circles that go larger and larger. And then once you outside of their intrusion protection system, that's cyber.
Right.
That's the DNS server sits outside of that.
So essentially you're talking about the layers of security that lead up into the broader internet.
Into the broader internet where it's just out in the wild.
You start out at your computer level and you build up to your wireless access, your router, internal network, up to your switches, any other routers you have, out into DNS stuff, your server DLP, maintenance,
data loss prevention systems.
Right.
All these are different just point solutions and software.
Right. Your data collection centers.
All that,
All of a sudden you've got this abstract layer that leads you out into the broader internet.
Exactly. I just look at those as like going down the street and they're just speed bumps.
Exactly.
And you're just hitting these speed bumps, right? And so what the sim does is sit behind all those speed bumps and it lets you know how close it is, or if it got to the closest thing.
It just picks those off the top that are just like, hey, this is new, this is abnormal.
He went a little closer. He's a little closer. Oh, he actually got something and he left.
Yeah, let's check this out. That was different, right?
That was different, right?
All right. So
SIM is worthwhile even for a smaller organization.
It's essential.
Yeah.
I mean, if you care about your data, that is.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's like, how do you force someone to care about their data? I mean, people still don't have home security systems, so it's like but that's the thing about it though. No one cares until they actually get robbed.
Yeah.
And then they recognized how important that was. That's why I actually, and this is not ideal. I was, I have this conversation with my engineer all the time. I was like, it won't change until there's like kind of what happened in the food industry where we found out how toxic our food was. And now people started to care about the organic symbol on a piece of product. Right.
So we need to have an Upton Sinclair.
Yeah. It won't change until you're interacting with a company. And because that auditing agency says, this is security approved, and you're like, okay, it's safe for me to shop there. Well, that is the only chance that we have, and for them to actually start caring about.
Well, like something you and I have talked about is
that should be a business
certifying board that gives a qualification to
that comes and audits you and says, hey, this is a safe place for your data.
Just like that organic
they're putting some protocols in place to protect your data.
Well, and like we touched on this a little bit earlier, like before we started recording, like there have been instances of ransomware. Yeah. There have been instances of like the Snowden leaks and like a variety of different things of like, hey, your data is in this space, whether you accept it or not, this is happening.
It's happening.
So just as a final ending note here, let's give 3 to 5, however many you come up with, just key points for individuals, things to be concerned about.
Again, it depends on the size and scale of your company, but of course you're going to need all those small nuanced things. But if you're talking more sophisticated stuff, like API security is very important. Just because the problem is you have all these different softwares, you have all these different tools, everything's producing metadata, everything's producing data in general. And you need to understand how those systems and those point systems are moving within your network and what vulnerabilities they have. Right. So API security is very important.
So right off the bat, I mean, API security, for those who aren't familiar, this is essentially how different software systems approach other software systems.
Correct. How they talk.
This is how your, Microsoft Excel talks to the cloud, for example.
Correct.
Or, how all of these different software systems interact.
Absolutely.
And having a continuous point, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but having this continuous point of connection from beginning to end, whether that be Microsoft Excel to Microsoft 365 to the cloud.
Absolutely.
Or, Amazon has their own version. I'm sure Google has their own version. Like having that continuous stream of data is extremely beneficial, but it's also important to secure and be aware of who has access to that. And exactly how
the best way to look at it, it's almost like, look at your phone. Think about how many apps you had when you first got your smartphone compared to how many apps you have now. all those apps have a connecting, and it's connecting to something else, and they all are just passing across data.
Right.
That's the API. That's the talking, the link between that.
Exactly.
And
Every
so
time
same thing happen in business, they started off small with apps. Now there's thousands of them. And there's no way to essentially manage or understand or how they talking and all. So all those are vulnerability points of access for a hacker.
So many of those apps interact with other apps. Like,
Absolutely.
if you have a password manager and that has your password to more than one app, if someone gets access to your password manager, they have access to all of your apps at the same time.
Or you could be like me and lose the password to my password manager.
Yeah.
That is definitely something we all need to get better at.
And then even in that scenario, they thought, okay, we'll make a centralized point of password management. We'll create an Okta. So you have one password and it gets you to all your system. Well, but Okta connects to something else. So it's just having those API security is important.
The bottom line is this is a really complex and nuanced subject. And, it's way outside of my area of expertise. You guys have some expertise in this area. I hope that we've been able to break this down and make it a little bit more accessible. I know this has been a little bit more high level discussion than we typically go for, but you can't really talk about this subject without it being a high level discussion.
No, I thought it was a good encompassing because they're all interrelated. Even like the idea of we started talking about like social capitalism. It's all talking about how we interact. And I guess the main point is we interact in a digital way at this point.
We do.
Especially, in this day and age, all of these things, especially from a technical level, not only a geopolitical or social perspective, like they're all interconnected, especially on the data level. Like it's impossible to talk about these things in a way where they're secluded in their own sense. Like, they're all interconnected in some sense. And in order to dive into any one of these topics, we need multiple hours. Just to dig into the nitty gritties of one aspect of them, let alone it as a broader topic.
I think I'm going to take that analogy though, because that was pretty off the cuff. The app idea, because that's just kind of that's the best way to describe it. Honestly,
that's
what is going on in your phone is what's going on in organizations. They start off with a few apps, now they have tons, and they're all interconnected, and they all interact with things. And there's a repository of that needs to be secure. Like there's security. There's door openers everywhere.
How do you lock all these script from coming here?
Yeah, how do you lock all these doors? Yeah, absolutely. How do you lock all these doors? Is exactly what's going on.
Well, thanks for coming on tonight. We'll definitely have to have you on again to
I liked it.
Further into detail on some of these things, and I'm sure there's going to be some updates on this because part of how we built into this conversation in the first place was just the threat of cyber attack from Russia on a national infrastructure scale. We talked about last week, and then I said, well, we should have my buddy Will on because I think it'll be outside the government side of this discussion. But
I think that's also a different. Those are different attack vectors than like enterprises is worrying about essentially.
Yeah,
they're I wouldn't even want to think of the type of attacks or frameworks they're using to do that.
It's a lot more straightforward in the vectors in which you're being approached,
right?
But at the same time,
the baseline of it's similar. Yeah,
it's so much more like structured.
Yeah,
but like targeted.
Yeah,
and so it's like you have dedicated people at it.
So in that standpoint is when you guys were asking me like, what is a hacker looking at? In those points, those are targeted attacks. They're literally creating something to get a certain outcome.
Right.
Whereas most hackers, they're just trying to get access and see what they have.
Just probing.
They're seeing what they have. They're walking in a house like, I didn't know this was $1 million house, and they had all these Picassos on the wall.
Right.
Interesting. I got access to Picassos. I'm taking all the Picassos. But they don't really know what they're going to have access to or what they're going to have. What the outcome's going to be. I guess is the point.
Right.
Unless it's a ransomware attack, then they know they want to shut down your systems.
Definitely a lot of things to think over for business owners, for key decision makers in enterprise, and just for ordinary people who for how you manage your own data security. So I hope you've all been able to take something away from this, and thanks for listening tonight.